You know what they say about the straw that breaks the camel's back? Well, let me tell you about the moment my back didn't just break. It exploded into 1,000 pieces, and from those pieces rose something my ungrateful daughter never saw coming. At Christmas dinner, my daughter looked me in the eye and said, "You're embarrassing, Mom." The next morning, I called my lawyer. By nightfall, the house she bragged about was no longer hers. But let me back up, because this story of betrayal, of a mother's love trampled underfoot, of justice finally served cold on a silver platter, this story starts long before that Christmas dinner from hell. My name is Margaret Ellis, and for 62 years, I've been playing by everyone else's rules. For 35 years, I stood in front of classrooms full of other people's children, teaching them respect, kindness, and the value of hard work. I wiped runny noses, dried tears, and celebrated every small victory as if it were my own. I was the teacher parents requested by name, the one who stayed late to help struggling students, the one who spent her own money on classroom supplies because I believed, God help me, I believed, that love and sacrifice were their own rewards. My little apartment still smells of cinnamon and chalk dust, you know. Even now, months later, I can catch that scent on quiet mornings. The Christmas lights I put up that year still blink faintly in my memory, reflecting off decades of framed student photos I'd never had the heart to take down. Hundreds of faces smiling back at me. Children who respected me, who valued what I gave them, who understood that behind every lesson was a woman who cared more about their futures than her own comfort. But there was one child who mattered more than all the rest. One child I thought I was raising right. One child who would grow up to slice my heart into ribbons with words sharper than any knife. Clara, my only child, my pride, my everything. When my husband died 7 years ago, my sweet William, who used to tell me I had enough love in my heart to heal the world, I thought Clara would be my anchor. I thought the bond between mother and daughter was unbreakable. I thought wrong about a lot of things. You want to know about sacrifice? Let me paint you a picture so vivid it'll burn into your retinas. Picture a woman in her 50s, working double shifts, tutoring kids after her regular teaching day ended, just so her daughter could chase her dreams of becoming an interior designer. Picture that same woman eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so she could afford to send her daughter to the prestigious design school Clara just had to attend. Not the perfectly good state school, mind you, but the expensive private one where all the serious designers went. I remember Clara calling me from her dorm room, gushing about fabric swatches and color theory while I sat in my dim kitchen, calculating whether I could afford both groceries and gas that week. "Mom, you should see the projects we're working on. This professor says I have real talent." And you know what? I was happy, genuinely, deeply happy, because my baby was happy. I skipped vacations, not that I could afford them anyway. I drove my beat-up Honda until the engine rattled like a bag of broken bones. I bought my clothes from thrift stores and told myself it was environmentally conscious. I turned down the thermostat in winter and wore sweaters to bed. Every penny, every sacrifice, every moment of discomfort was worth it because Clara was building her future. When she graduated, I was in the front row, tears streaming down my face as she walked across that stage. She looked so beautiful, so accomplished, so full of potential. She hugged me after the ceremony and whispered, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom." Those 8 words, I held them like precious gems, polished them in my memory until they shone brighter than any diploma. But here's where the fairy tale takes a dark turn, where the sweet daughter you raised with love and sacrifice transforms into someone you barely recognize. Clara met Derek during her second year working at a high-end design firm. Derek, the real estate agent with the perfect smile, the expensive suits, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to choose between electricity and groceries. Derek, who drove a BMW and took Clara to restaurants where the appetizers cost more than I spent on food in a week. I should have seen the signs then. The way Clara started talking differently, using words like aesthetic and curated to describe everything from her coffee shop choice to her nail polish. The way she began to wince slightly when I'd show up to meet her, wearing my sensible teacher clothes and carrying my practical handbag. The way her hugs became shorter, more perfunctory, like she was checking an obligation off her list. But love makes you blind, doesn't it? Love makes you excuse the inexcusable and rationalize the irrational. When Clara started canceling our weekly lunch dates because she was swamped with client meetings, I told myself she was just building her career. When our daily phone calls dwindled to weekly check-ins, then bi-weekly texts, I convinced myself she was simply growing up, becoming independent. The wedding was beautiful, I'll give her that. I spent my entire retirement savings on her dress, the one she fell in love with at that boutique, where the saleswoman looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in. Mom, it's perfect, Clara had whispered, tears in her eyes as she stood before the mirror. Are you sure you can afford it? I lied. I told her yes, of course I could afford it. What kind of mother would I be if I couldn't buy my only daughter her dream wedding dress? I didn't tell her I'd cashed in my pension early, paying hefty penalties that would leave me eating ramen for months. I didn't tell her I'd taken out a loan against my car. I didn't tell her that watching her face light up in that dress was worth every financial sacrifice I'd ever have to make. The wedding reception was held at the country club where Derek's family were members. I sat at the family table, wearing my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for William's funeral and hadn't worn since, watching my daughter dance with her new husband while his parents looked on with approval. I felt so proud, so grateful to be part of this beautiful moment. That's when Clara and Derek announced their next dream. They wanted to buy a house, not just any house, mind you, but a stunning colonial in the best neighborhood, with 4 bedrooms and a gourmet kitchen where Clara could entertain Derek's clients. It was perfect, they said, except for one tiny problem. They didn't have enough for the down payment. I knew what was coming before the words left Clara's mouth. I could see it in her eyes, that familiar look she'd had as a child when she wanted something she couldn't afford. Mom, she said, pulling me aside after the reception, I know this is a lot to ask, but Derek and I have been talking. They needed $80,000. $80,000 that represented every penny I'd saved for my own future, my own security, my own peace of mind in my golden years. The money I'd planned to use for travel, for home repairs, for medical bills, for all the uncertainties that come with aging alone. But she was my daughter, my only child, and when she looked at me with those eyes, William's eyes, and talked about building a life, starting a family, creating the kind of home where I'd be welcomed for holidays and Sunday dinners, what else could I do? I signed over my life savings. I put my name on that mortgage as a co-signer, making myself legally responsible for a debt that would follow me to my grave if things went wrong. I watched my bank account drain to nearly zero and told myself this was what mothers do. This was love in action. The house was everything Clara had dreamed of and more. I remember the first time she gave me a tour, her voice bubbling with excitement as she showed off the marble countertops, the hardwood floors, the walk-in closet that was bigger than my entire bedroom. Can you believe this is ours, Mom? she'd said, spinning around in the grand foyer. I keep thinking I'm gonna wake up and it'll all be a dream. I bit my tongue from reminding her it was ours because of my sacrifice. I smiled and nodded and told her how happy I was for her. Because that's what good mothers do, right? They don't keep score. They don't hold their sacrifices over their children's heads like weapons. They love unconditionally, give freely, and trust that respect and gratitude will follow. God, I was such a fool. The changes started slowly. Clara's visits to my apartment became less frequent. She was busy decorating, she explained, busy hosting dinner parties for Derek's business associates, busy with her expanding client base now that she had such an impressive home to showcase her design skills. I understood. I really did. A new house requires attention, and Clara had always been detail oriented. Our phone conversation shifted too. Instead of asking how I was doing, how I was adjusting to retirement, whether I needed anything, Clara would launch into monologues about her latest design project, the dinner party she was planning, the vacation she and Derek were considering. I became her audience rather than her confidant, a sounding board for her excitement rather than a participant in her life. I told myself this was normal. This was what happened when children grew up and started their own families. The parent steps back, gives space, allows the new generation to flourish. I reminded myself that Clara was thriving, that my sacrifices had created this success, that watching her happiness should be reward enough. But late at night, in my quiet apartment with its fading photos and secondhand furniture, I felt something I didn't want to acknowledge. I felt forgotten, used, taken for granted. The holidays became particularly painful. Thanksgiving at Clara and Derek's house, where I was seated at the card table with Derek's teenage nephew, while the adults discussed real estate trends and wine pairings at the main table. Christmas morning, where I was expected to arrive after 10. Not too early, Mom. You know how Derek is before his coffee. With arms full of expensive gifts for a daughter who gave me generic candles and a card signed with just her first name. I started to notice how Clara talked to me versus how she talked to others. With Derek's parents, her voice carried a tone of respect, even deference. With her clients, she was professional and engaging. With her friends, she was warm and animated. But with me, her voice carried a subtle note of impatience, as if my very presence was an inconvenience she had to manage. The breaking point came gradually, then all at once. Like Ernest Hemingway said about going bankrupt, gradually, then suddenly. Except this wasn't financial ruin. This was emotional devastation of the worst kind. This was watching the person you love most in the world treat you like you're an embarrassment, a burden, a relic from a past they'd rather forget. The signs were all there if I'd been brave enough to see them. The way Clara would change the subject when I mentioned my financial struggles, the way she'd avoid introducing me to her new friends, or when she did, would quickly usher me away after the briefest of conversations, the way she'd check her phone constantly during our visits, as if she was looking for any excuse to cut our time short. But I kept making excuses for her. She's busy, she's stressed, she's adjusting to married life, new house, new responsibilities, new social circle. I rationalized every slight, explained away every hurt, because facing the truth would have meant admitting that my unconditional love had created a monster of entitlement. The Christmas from hell started like any other. Clara had invited me for dinner, along with Derek's parents and a few of their couple friends. I'd brought my famous apple pie, the recipe I'd perfected over decades of teaching potlucks and family gatherings. I'd also brought gifts, a beautiful cashmere scarf for Clara that had cost me 2 weeks of grocery money, and an expensive bottle of whiskey for Derek that I'd researched carefully to make sure it met his sophisticated tastes. I dressed carefully that day, my best slacks, a nice blouse, the pearl earrings William had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look presentable for Clara's friends, wanted her to be proud to call me her mother. I even got my hair done that week, spending money I couldn't afford because I hoped it would make Clara smile when she saw me. The house looked stunning, of course. Clara had outdone herself with the decorations, the kind of magazine-perfect Christmas setup that probably cost more than I spent in 3 months. Everything was coordinated, elegant, expensive. I felt like a child pressing her nose against a candy store window, marveling at a world that was beautiful, but somehow not quite meant for me. Dinner conversation flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to: exotic vacation destinations, stock portfolios, the best private schools for children Clara and Derek didn't even have yet. I sat quietly, smiling and nodding, content to just watch my daughter hold court in her beautiful dining room. Playing the perfect hostess in the home my sacrifice had made possible. That's when I made my fatal mistake. In a moment of nostalgia, wanting to connect with Clara in front of her new friends, I started telling a story from her childhood. It was innocent, sweet even, about the time 8-year-old Clara had tried to redecorate her bedroom by coloring on the walls with markers, insisting she was improving the aesthetic. I thought it was charming, a cute glimpse into the origins of her design passion. "Oh my God, Mom, stop! You're embarrassing me." The words hit me like a physical blow. The laughter around the table turned awkward, forced. Derek chuckled in that way men do when they're uncomfortable. His parents exchanged glances. The friends Clara was so desperate to impress looked at me with something between pity and secondhand embarrassment. But it wasn't the public humiliation that shattered me. It was Clara's face, the look of genuine irritation, of shame that I was her mother, of regret that she'd invited me into her perfect world where I clearly didn't belong. In that moment, I saw myself through her eyes, the embarrassing mother with her outdated stories and unfashionable clothes, the needy woman who reminded everyone that Clara hadn't always lived in marble-countered luxury. I finished my dinner in silence, made polite conversation when spoken to, thanked them for the lovely evening, kissed Clara goodbye on the cheek while she stood stiffly, already mentally moving on to after-dinner drinks with her sophisticated friends, drove home through the falling snow with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The silence in my apartment that night was deafening, not peaceful, devastating. I sat in my old armchair, the one Clara had suggested I replace numerous times because it didn't fit the aesthetic of modern living, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not my heart, that had been breaking slowly for months. Something deeper, something fundamental about who I thought I was and what I thought my life meant. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the folder I kept in my desk drawer. Property documents, mortgage papers, bank statements, all the proof of what I'd given, what I'd sacrificed, what I'd invested in a daughter who saw me as an embarrassment. I spread them across my kitchen table like tarot cards, revealing a future I was finally ready to embrace. Every document bore my name. The house title, Margaret Ellis. The mortgage, Margaret Ellis, primary borrower. The down payment, withdrawn from the savings account of Margaret Ellis. Even the beautiful landscaping Clara loved to show off had been funded by a loan I'd co-signed. Legally, morally, financially, that house was mine. I'd bought my daughter a palace, and she'd repaid me by treating me like a peasant who should be grateful for crumbs from her table. I raised a woman who values image over integrity, I whispered to the empty room. Time to remind her where the mirror came from. That night, I didn't sleep. I planned. For the first time in years, I planned something for myself, something that didn't involve sacrifice or giving or putting someone else's needs before my own. I planned justice. Monday morning, I called my lawyer, not the family attorney who'd handled William's estate. He was too close to the situation, too likely to try to talk me out of what needed to be done. I found someone new, someone who specialized in property law and asset protection, someone who understood that sometimes love has to come with consequences. Mrs. Ellis, he said after reviewing my documents, you have several options here. Given that you're the primary borrower and the title holder, you have significant legal standing. I explained what I wanted to do. His eyebrows rose higher with each detail, but he didn't try to dissuade me. Maybe he'd seen this story before, the sacrificial parent finally reaching their breaking point. Maybe he had his own ungrateful children. Either way, he understood that this wasn't about money. This was about dignity. We moved quickly. I transferred the house title to a charitable trust that supported single mothers finishing their college education, women like I'd been decades ago, struggling to build better lives for their children through education and hard work, women who understood sacrifice because they lived it every day. I canceled my co-signature on Clara's business loan, the one she'd sweet-talked me into guaranteeing just 6 months earlier when she wanted to expand her design firm. Without my backing, the bank would demand immediate payment or alternative collateral. Clara's credit alone wouldn't be enough. I donated my remaining savings to a literacy foundation in William's name, ensuring that his memory would be honored by helping children learn to read, something he'd always been passionate about, something meaningful, unlike the expensive dinners and luxury items my money had been funding. The cottage I moved to was everything Clara's house wasn't: small instead of sprawling, cozy instead of impressive, affordable instead of financially crippling. It sat near the coast, 3 hours away from the life I'd built around a daughter who didn't want me in it, close enough to the ocean that I could hear waves instead of traffic, far enough from my old life that Clara couldn't show up uninvited to guilt me into reversing my decisions. I left no forwarding address, didn't tell anyone where I was going, just packed my most precious belongings: William's photos, my teaching awards, the handmade cards from grateful students, and disappeared from a life where I'd been taken for granted for far too long. The phone calls started 3 days later. 72 missed calls in 18 hours. Voice messages that evolved from confusion to panic, to rage, to desperation. I listened to each one once, then deleted it with the same methodical care I'd once used to grade papers. Mom, they said the house is under investigation by some trust. What's going on? Call me back. Delete. Mom, this isn't funny anymore. Derek's freaking out. The bank called about the business loan. You need to fix this right now. Delete. I don't understand what you're trying to prove. We can talk about this like adults. I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings, okay? But this is insane. Delete. They said you donated everything? Everything? How could you do this to us? We're gonna lose everything because you're having some kind of breakdown. Delete. Mom, please. I know you're angry, but think about what you're doing. Think about Derek's career, my business. Think about the family we want to have. Don't let one stupid comment ruin everything we've built. Delete. Fine. You want to play games? Two can play. Derek's lawyer says we can contest this. We can prove you're not mentally competent. Don't think we won't fight this. Delete. The final message came a week later. Clara's voice, broken and raw in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child with a scraped knee. "I don't understand, Mom. I don't understand how you could hate me this much. I thought, I thought you loved me unconditionally. I thought that's what mothers did." That one I played twice before deleting it. Not because I felt guilty. Guilt was an emotion I'd left behind in my old life. I played it twice because I wanted to hear the exact moment Clara finally understood what unconditional love looked like when it reached its conditions. Because here's what she didn't understand, what so many children fail to grasp. Unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional acceptance of disrespect. It doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity on the altar of their convenience. It doesn't mean funding a lifestyle built on looking down at the person who made it possible. Unconditional love sometimes means loving someone enough to let them fall. It means loving them enough to teach them consequences. It means loving them enough to stop enabling their worst impulses, even when it breaks your heart to watch them struggle. I loved Clara unconditionally. That's exactly why I had to walk away. The cottage became my sanctuary in ways I never expected. Mornings started with coffee on the porch, watching seagulls dive for fish while the sun painted the sky in shades of hope. I planted a small garden, vegetables I'd actually eat instead of expensive flowers meant to impress neighbors I didn't know. I volunteered at the local library, reading to children who hung on every word like it was magic. For the first time in decades, I had enough money to live comfortably. Not extravagantly. I'd never been that person anyway, but comfortably. I could afford groceries without calculating every purchase. I could buy a book without guilt. I could go to a movie or have dinner at the little seafood place down the road without checking my bank balance first. People in town knew me as Margaret, the retired teacher who helped kids with their homework and brought homemade cookies to community events. They didn't know about Clara, about the sacrifice and betrayal, about the house I'd given away, or the daughter who'd called me embarrassing. Here I was just Margaret, whole, worthy, enough. The peace was intoxicating. No more walking on eggshells around Clara's moods. No more pretending that her casual cruelty was just stress or busy schedules. No more sacrificing my dignity for the privilege of being tolerated by my own child. No more lying awake at night, wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed as a mother. I hadn't failed as a mother. I'd failed as a boundary setter. I'd failed as a self-advocate. I'd failed to teach Clara that respect is not optional, even, especially, within families. Those failures I could live with because I'd finally found the courage to correct them. Some evenings, I'd sit on my porch with a glass of wine and imagine Clara in her beautiful house, surrounded by all the trappings of success my sacrifice had provided, finally understanding that respect and gratitude aren't old-fashioned concepts. They're the foundation of every meaningful relationship. I'd picture her realizing that image without integrity is just an expensive lie, that a mother's love has value beyond its utility. But mostly, I didn't think about Clara at all. I thought about the sunset, the sound of waves, the book I was reading, the lesson plan I was developing for the literacy program. I thought about William and how proud he'd be that I'd finally found my spine. I thought about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. Stretching ahead of me like an open road, I was finally free to travel. 6 months later, I received a letter. Not from Clara. She'd apparently learned that chapter of our story was closed. It was from Derek's mother, a woman who'd always been polite but distant during family gatherings. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, the kind of stationery people use when they want to make an impression. The letter was an apology, not on Clara's behalf, but her own. She wrote about watching my humiliation at that Christmas dinner, about recognizing the pain in my eyes, about regretting that she hadn't spoken up in my defense. She wrote about her own mother, who'd been treated similarly by entitled children who'd forgotten where they came from. I wanted you to know, she wrote in careful cursive, that some of us understood what you gave, what you sacrificed, and what you lost that night. Clara may not appreciate your worth, but others do. I hope you found peace. I wrote back, a brief note thanking her for her kindness. I didn't mention Clara or the house or the money. I simply told her I was well, I was happy, and I was finally living a life that honored my own worth. Because that's what this story is really about, isn't it? Not revenge, restoration, not punishment, education, not hatred, love that finally learned boundaries. The news reached me through my former neighbor, who'd tracked down my address through the post office forwarding service I'd forgotten to cancel. Clara and Derek had moved into a small apartment across town. The design business had folded without the financial backing I'd provided. Derek's real estate career had suffered when his own financial troubles became public knowledge in their tight-knit professional community. They were struggling, working ordinary jobs, living ordinary lives, discovering what most people know instinctively, that respect and humility aren't character flaws to be embarrassed by. They're survival skills. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, no vindictive pleasure in their reduced circumstances. I felt nothing. The absence of concern, the freedom that comes from no longer being responsible for someone else's poor choices. They were adults facing the consequences of their actions, learning lessons I should have taught years earlier. A year passed, then another. My life in the coastal town became rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. I had friends, real friends who valued my company rather than my financial contributions. I had purpose through my volunteer work. I had peace in my daily routines and simple pleasures. I learned to paddleboard at 64. I took a pottery class and discovered I had a talent for creating beautiful, imperfect bowls that held soup perfectly. I adopted an elderly cat from the local shelter, a grumpy tabby named Winston who'd been returned twice for attitude problems. We understood each other perfectly. On quiet evenings, I'd reflect on the journey that brought me to this place, the years of sacrifice, the gradual erosion of respect, the moment of clarity that changed everything. I'd think about other mothers living the same story, giving everything, receiving nothing, accepting disrespect as love, because they didn't know the difference. And I'd hope they'd find their courage before it was too late. I'd hope they'd understand that teaching respect is an act of love, that saying no is sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do, that walking away can be the most powerful lesson of all. Because here's what I know now, what I wish I'd learned decades earlier. You cannot love someone into respecting you. You cannot sacrifice your way into their gratitude. You cannot diminish yourself enough to make them value you more. Respect is either given freely or it's not real respect at all. The mother who gave away everything because her daughter called her embarrassing, she didn't disappear. She evolved. She became a woman who understood her worth, who demanded respect, who chose dignity over desperation. She became someone her own mother would be proud of, someone her husband would admire, someone she could finally look at in the mirror without flinching. They called me embarrassing. Turns out I was unforgettable. This story isn't about a mother's revenge. It's about a mother's awakening. It's about understanding that love without respect is slavery in disguise, that sacrifice without appreciation is just enabling bad behavior, that unconditional love sometimes requires setting conditions on how you'll allow yourself to be treated. Some of you listening to this know exactly what I'm talking about. You've given everything to children who take it for granted. You've sacrificed your dignity on the altar of their convenience. You've accepted crumbs of affection and called it love because you were afraid that demanding more might leave you with nothing. But here's what I learned in that little cottage by the sea. What I want every parent to understand. You cannot pour from an empty cup. You cannot teach respect by accepting disrespect. You cannot love someone into loving you back, but you can love yourself enough to walk away from those who don't value what you offer. The hardest lesson of parenthood isn't teaching your children to succeed. It's teaching them to fail with grace, to face consequences with courage, to understand that respect is earned through behavior, not inherited through biology. Margaret Ellis, the embarrassing mother, she taught her daughter the most important lesson of all, that love has limits, respect has requirements, and sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is step back and let their child learn what life is like without a safety net they never appreciated. And in teaching that lesson, she finally learned to value herself. Have you ever been taken for granted by family? Have you sacrificed your dignity for someone else's comfort? Have you mistaken being needed for being valued, being useful for being loved? Your story matters. Your dignity has worth. Your respect is not negotiable. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for them and for yourself is walk away. And sometimes walking away is how you finally find your way home.